So, why is it some congregations have good, successful stewardship programs pretty consistently and others do not? As it says on the slide here, there are lots of good reasons for that, but there are a number of them that connect directly to the board in some important ways, and I thought we'd go over those for a bit here today. Probably first thing that comes to mind from my experience as a stewardship consultant, as somebody who worked stewardship in my own congregation for some years, but before I started doing this with the UUA, the congregations that do well have a really coordinated approach to stewardship in general and to their campaign in particular. And what I mean by a coordinated effort is the expectation is the stewardship team is going to take the lead role. They're going to do most of the coordinating, but they're not going to do this as some standalone program that only they do. And the congregations that have good programs, that group teams up with the finance team, frequently with the endowment team, if you've got one of those in place, with the membership group, and certainly with the board. Everybody sees this as a common endeavor for the leadership team writ large to be taken part in. Everybody has a supportive role, and they all coordinate with each other. Second benchmark that really makes a difference is successful congregations have year-round conversations about stewardship. And I'm not talking about just the idea of having conversations about we need everybody to pledge, but talking about what pledging represents in terms of your commitment as a member and what you're trying to do to pass forward what you've been fortunate enough to inherit as a member here. You have that conversation in lots of small ways. You have it throughout the year. It's led by more people than the stewardship team, and it's frequently pegged on something else. It's not just let's stop and talk about stewardship, but let's talk about stewardship as service, as paying it forward, and so forth. In terms of the boards, this third item here is probably the most important. It's a term I refer to as leadership by example. And here's what we mean by that. Board members make a meaningful pledge consistent with their circumstances. They generally are fair share pledges in accordance with the suggested fair share giving guide. Not everybody can always do that, but most people can if they choose to do so. Board members are among those who make testimonials from time to time on why they serve and why they contribute financially. And when in those seasons when you're using visiting stewards as your stewardship approach, the board to a person serves as a visiting steward. I'll give you a good case point about how effective this can be. The congregation, I just moved a few months ago, but the congregation I was a member of for about 20 years, about 2 years ago, we had probably the best stewardship campaign we've ever had. I mean, the results were just terrific. The effort was easy. And here's one of the things that made a big difference. When we had our kickoff Sunday, I was able to stand in front of the congregation and say something along the lines of the following. As you all know, this is the start of our annual stewardship campaign. I'd like to share with you some important news at the start of the campaign. Your board has already been looking at this campaign and acknowledged the importance of us having a good, successful campaign this year in particular. And so I'm pleased to report to you that everyone on the board has already made an advance pledge. And that particular year, we decided to take a pretty simple approach, and we were asking everybody to consider a 5% increase as a minimum for them to look at for their own giving this year. I was able to say everybody on the board has either increased by 5% or more, or in cases where that wasn't possible, they agreed to do so over 2 years, and they've made a pledge to make that happen. Everybody on the board is on the fair share chart at some point, and all are looking to move a little further down that chart as they can. And we're using visiting stewards this year as an opportunity for us all to meet one-on-one and talk about our role and what we hope for the congregation. All your board members are visiting stewards, and so you're very likely to have a board member come and ask to have that conversation with you. Best campaign we ever had, and I'm convinced the leadership role that the board took was one of the reasons that thing went so well. The last thing among the big benchmarks here, I think, make a real difference here, and boards help set the standard for this, is those congregations have very clear expectations of what we ask of ourselves as members. What we're expected to do as best we can in terms of being present and participating in congregational life and volunteering from time to time and offering any special skills we might have, and in making and honoring a meaningful pledge. You start that conversation before somebody ever joins as part of the new member orientation, and we remind each other throughout the year that those are the things that we expect of ourselves as members. And essentially, we treat our members like adults. We don't treat them like as children who can't take bad news or can't look at some complicated data. We work hard at making things palatable and understandable for people, but we remind people we do come from the Congregationalist tradition. This is our congregation. We're responsible for it. Most of us didn't found this place. We were fortunate enough to inherit it from people who did the work years prior. Now it's our turn to enjoy it and burnish it, and we're going to pass it on to people who don't even know yet. Good stewardship is a good part of that conversation. But the congregations I know who've been consistently doing well hit those 4 benchmarks on a pretty regular basis and don't give me a lot of work. They don't need a lot of help from outside folks here. So a few things I'd like for you to think about when you look at stewardship as a board member. One, why is this important? Well, the obvious thing is how we raise enough money to pay our bills and pay our staff a decent salary. I'm sorry, somebody have a question or comment there? Okay, I heard a voice in the background there. But there's another set of reasons that we frequently forget here. Being a member of something is different from being a customer or being a shopper somewhere here. The fact of the matter is money is a somewhat important thing for all of us. We don't have an unlimited supply on it. And so having a position that says, I think this is important enough, not only to give of my time and effort, but to share what little bit of hard-earned money I've got, is a level of commitment and a way of saying, I really am in this for the long haul and I want to succeed. It's an important part of that commitment and that conversation to being a member. So if that's true, why is this so hard? Why do we have a hard time having that conversation? To some degree, all denominations do. I've had the opportunity to do some visiting and some work with some other denominations here. We seem to have a harder time than most of them do. There's anecdotal evidence that says our average pledge across the denomination here probably runs about 2 to 3% of our adjusted gross income, which is a pretty low level. And I think that is because, and we have some difficulty talking about it, because we have habitually not talked about stewardship as a matter of our ethics as members of the congregation or as a part of community building. We've treated it as a bill paying exercise that we talk about for about 6 weeks a year and then put it in the drawer and don't bring it out to next year. Whereas a number of folks who do this well figure, no, this is part of what it means to be in a community with each other, to share our resources as well as our time and effort. I'm going to do a bit of self-advertising here. You'll see on the bottom a link here. I'm hoping a number of you are already subscribers to our blog. If you're not, I invite you to go take a look at our page there, stewardshipforus.com. Click on the blog, and there's a little search window there. Put the word envelopes or elevator in there, and they'll take you to my stewardship elevator speech, something I wrote a couple years ago. Nothing really particularly original there, but I found it's a pretty useful way to express to people why this is an important thing to do. And the short version is, if you ask most of us, the sense of community we have in our congregations is really important. This is where we live our values out. It's where we have an opportunity to let those values influence the rest of the world. It's where, for most of us, our closest friends are. It's where we want the next generation to be educated about what's important in life and what values mean. So if all of that is true, and I think for most of us it is, why is it we're sweating bullets every year to get another 2 or 3% increase in our budget if we've been flat for the last couple of years? There's a bit of a disconnect there somewhere, and if we treat stewardship as just bill paying, you get that sort of a disconnect. If it's true, this is where our values are represented, and this community represents what we think is a good thing on the planet, then stewardship shouldn't be quite that much a challenge for us. But take a look at it and read it and see if you find it's useful. And if you do, by the way, you're more than welcome to use it in any way you'd like to. Feeding to that process of a relationship, there are a number of questions that I see raised a lot in congregations I visit. And we very often get the answer wrong to these questions. And that in turn sets us up for a challenge doing good work in stewardship. So let's just kind of run down the list real quickly here, and I think you'll see how it connects the dots in a larger sense. First question is, whose church is this? Whose congregation is this? I often ask this, and people think, it's a trick question. I know the answer. It's the congregation's church here. It doesn't belong to the board, and it doesn't belong to the minister. And I say that is 1/3 the right answer. It is, in fact, this congregation is responsible for the church. It's ours to enjoy, not as owners, but as stewards. But the other 2/3 of that answer is the people who founded this organization. For most of us, our congregation has been around for a while, so people have passed away and new generations running. But I feel that, those people who founded it are still, this is still their congregation. We have a real, an obligation that I'm glad to honor, to pay back what they did and made possible for us. I told the story last night of the congregation that I just left a while back. When they started back in the 1950s, they were meeting in school cafeterias and gymnasiums for a couple of years, and finally decided they really needed their own place. About something more than half, almost 2/3 of the families who started that congregation took out second mortgages to make it possible for them to buy the building. That is real commitment. That was just extraordinary. I mean, that so many people would have done that. They took a chance and made it happen here. I feel like those people are still present, and I owe something to them for what they did for us here. And the other 1/3 of the answer is there's a future generation who's going to follow us here, some of whom aren't even born yet. You and I will never know them. Doesn't make any difference. We know we're going to pass this on to somebody else at some point. And I would like for us to pass it on in good shape so they spend their time talking about mission and vision and community, and not worrying about, we've got a deficit for the 10th year in a row. How are we going to handle that? So whose church it is an answer in time as well as in people here. We've already talked about the second item here, who's responsible for the stewardship of the budget drive and the stewardship program generally. Yeah, you really do need a standing committee who works the year round to help organize and drive that, but it is a shared responsibility among the whole leadership to make that program go. I just posted a blog this morning on our website about a half hour ago about, so why is it you might need a standing committee, and what do they do the rest of the year after the campaign's over? I invite you to take a look at that. Should the minister and the rest of the professional staff had any sort of leading role in your stewardship efforts, including the campaign? Absolutely. If you think about it, it's interesting that we even asked that question. The most highly trained, the most experienced, the only really salaried people you have looking after the welfare of your congregation. We're asking, should they take part in this lifeblood exercise? Of course they should. Every once in a while, and by the way, this is a unique question in the churches. If you ask any other nonprofit or a university, should your leading official have a role in your fundraising, they'll look at you like you're nuts. Of course, they're well suited and they have some responsibilities in that area. This is an area that years ago ministers were a bit conflicted on. Most ministers I work with now absolutely get this, are glad to play a role. Every once in a while, somebody will tell me, I don't want the minister to know what people pledge because they might treat people differently. My experience is that doesn't happen, but if it does, you have the wrong minister. Stewardship's not your problem. You got a staffing problem here. And that generally just doesn't happen. The other reason that's important, your minister is responsible for the overall spiritual and operational welfare of the congregation. They want to know who's ill, who's doing well, who's having problems, who's got new successes, who's doing volunteering. And I would submit to you, knowing how the distribution of gifts is coming in is an important part of that as well. One of the books I recommend to people very often is Not Your Parents' Offering Plate. Very small little book written by Chris Christopher, an Episcopalian, as I recall. And he has a good discussion there that he recommends, and I've seen people do this, he recommends ministers in particular have a weekly mission to go out and buy a box of thank you notes, put them in an upper desk drawer, and part of your job that week is to make sure that box is empty by the end of the week. You send some old-fashioned snail mail, handwritten thank you notes to different people for different things throughout the congregation. And some of those would go to your large donors who've made a real difference and continue to contribute and to say thank you to them. And part of that is for people who, because you know your congregation, know they're having some financial challenges, but chose to pledge anyway, to just acknowledge that we realize this is a particularly challenging time you're making a sacrifice to do this, and it's an example for us all. Thank you. Or for people making their first time pledges, thank you them for starting down that road of commitment as well. So yeah, the ministry absolutely needs to be a part of that. I surprised some people in saying your director of religious education, or whichever term yours uses. Ari is in a series of title changes these days, and your music director ought to have some feel for how the pledging is going as well. They certainly don't need to know how anybody pledges, but it's an interesting and useful thing for those two individuals, and perhaps others if you have staff that interacts with a particular group, to have some feel for how that community pledges as a whole, and make that part of their conversation with their own groups here. Along the lines of, I think we have one of the best RE programs in the country. I'm so delighted we have this. I want to remind us all, this exists because we're part of a larger congregation here. There's a structure around us that sometimes we don't all see and interact with, but that's what makes all of this possible. And I hope we all remember that when we make our pledge commitments here. I like to encourage people, don't treat your pledge as a buffet where you're putting a certain amount in because you want to support a certain program. A healthy congregation is one that has lots of different activities and priorities and things going on. And I, as a member, want this whole organization to be healthy, and I want them to have the resources to do what I think is important to do for the community, whether I take part in them or not. If you've ever heard me sing, you'll understand why I'm not in the choir. I can't read music. I don't play an instrument. Doesn't make any difference. That's a really important part of congregational life, so I want to make sure there's enough resources to do that well. I'm going to start collecting Social Security pretty soon here, so I'm unlikely to have a child going into RE in this life cycle. That's okay. That's a really important part of our congregation, and that's how we pass on our values to the next generation. So that needs to succeed as well. So getting everybody, just reminding them occasionally what we like and what we do in the congregation is important. But so are those things that aren't important to you, but are important to the person sitting left and right of you on a Sunday morning, and we want to support all that. Those of you I've worked with know I'm a big fan of using visiting stewards. If you take the time to train and prepare the visiting stewards well, so both they and the people they're visiting are comfortable. And I often get the question, who should be visiting stewards? I sometimes have people think visiting stewards ought to be people who are comfortable going to somebody else's house and asking them for money. And that'd be a pretty small meeting. You could probably do that in a Volkswagen bus with some room left over here. And part of making that a bigger community is doing a good training, so people are comfortable doing that. But the longer and more important answer is, if you're going to use visiting stewards, that population of visiting stewards should look like your congregation in miniature. If it's only people who are in your first or second quartile making large pledges, who've been a member for 10 or 20 years, or baby boomers, that's not going to work for you as a congregation as a whole. You certainly need a lot of folks like that, but you want to find some new pledges. You want to find some people in third or fourth quartile who are doing the best they can, but making good pledges, but aren't big pledges. People who are making their first pledge in the last year or two here. In other words, your congregation in miniature. And so hopefully when people go to visit somebody, there's some common connection. They both have kids in RE. They're about the same age. They're in about the same quartile of giving. There's just a natural connection to do that here. And it's also a subtle but important way of saying this is not just for the people who've got some money that can do this a little easier than others. This is a conversation we're all going to have. So I encourage you to take a good look at using visiting stewards, get some training so it's easier to do and it's done well, and get a broad base of people in there. We pretty well answered the last one here. When should we talk about money? I should be talking about money and generosity and giving all year. You intersperse it through your conversations about other things. I'm hoping a lot of you are doing testimonials throughout the year, not just around stewardship time. And some of those are about why I volunteer, for example, and some are about what this congregation means to me and what it's done to help my family out in a tough time. And some of it ought to be about, I'm not made of money, but this is a place I really want to put the money in, and here's why I do that. Scatter those throughout the year so that when the campaign starts, people have already got their head in the game, if I may use that term. And finally, occasionally I'll have people say, boy, people really can't meet that suggested fair share giving level, I don't think. Well, certainly some people can't, but the reality is if you'll take a few minutes to look through that form, and I'll be the first to admit it looks a little confusing when you first look at it. It's really not that hard. It starts at 2% of our adjusted gross income after taking out a couple of big deductions. I would submit to you, most of us could make that standard. I told the story with the group of your colleagues last night. If you imagine this is the Fair Share Giving Guide, but 25 years ago, we were members of our congregation, had been there about 2 years. We were PBS pledgers, give what you can when you can. We had sort of an informal process. And when about our third year, we started using the Fair Share Giving Guide. So we said, all right, let's take a look and see where we are in this chart. Well, let me get my hand free. Here's where I was on the chart. We weren't even on it. We were off the bottom here. That was bad enough. But what was really embarrassing is when I realized, what would it take for me to at least get on the chart? It really wasn't much. It was just a very few bucks a month. So we did that year, and every year since then, that's the first thing I encourage people to look at. At the end of the year, you're starting to get your taxes ready, and you're thinking about the spending you're going to do next year. Pull that thing out. Let's see where we are and say, if we wanted to move up one notch, what would that look like? Could we do that this year? And if not, could I do that over 2 years? So it's a healthy conversation process to have, and congregations who use that guide as sort of a conversation starter generally have a healthier process. We need to recognize that a lot of the people coming in and joining our congregations now, particularly Generation X, Y, or millennials, really are effectively unchurched as adults and don't have much of a clue about pledging. And if you just say do what you can when you can, you're going to get a haphazard contribution that doesn't help a lot and doesn't make a lot of sense to them. I'm a big fan of giving people lots of information. Share with them your giving quartiles, give them the Fair Share Guide, talk about what your mean and your median pledge are. A lot of congregations divide the budget up by the number of pledging households and say, if we were all just going to do our equal share, here's what that would look like. Give people lots of tools and numbers to work with and let them find a level that makes sense for them. But don't just say do whatever you think's right and we'll appreciate it. PBS can do that because 50% of their money comes from other sources. For most of our congregations, about 90 to 95% comes from our pledges. So we need to be just a little more intentional about that. So why is it that people do contribute? This first point is a bit odd to say here. People don't contribute to fill holes in the budget. They give to foster growth and to live their vision. The people on this call are probably the exception to that. You understand the importance of filling the gaps and paying the bills and getting the grass cut and all those mechanical things that we need to have an institution run. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying if we're just telling people we don't have enough to pay the bills, that's not going to inspire people. And we do want to inspire them. A, it's the right thing to do. And B, we're in competition with a lot of other good and worthy causes as well. And so what we want to do is connect what we're asking people to give with what that means in terms of living our values and living our mission and vision as a congregation. And we just might point out to people, if you like everything we're doing here, let me just remind you, we could do more of it if we could all share just a bit more. Or we wouldn't be facing the prospect of actually making cutbacks on things we all acknowledge we love and are doing well, but don't seem willing to share the resources to do it. But if you help people have an understanding about what this community means in their lives and into the world at large and what their gifts will actually accomplish, I think you'll do much better. Your experience is probably like mine. I have a number of charitable causes I support. I have no shortage of correspondence coming from those guys thanking me for what I've done, inviting me to give just a little more, and hey, we'll send you a coffee mug or a backpack or something if you do that. And here's what we did with your contribution. I get that stuff constantly. I bet you do too. Sometimes we're a little too slow and a little too shy about doing that. So connect what people's gifts are given with what it specifically does to accomplish some good, and you'll do better. How you have that conversation varies a little bit depending on what generation you're working with. Most of our congregations have got at least 4 active generations as part of our membership. On the left, you see what I call the builder generations, basically the World War II generation. Still a number of those folks out doing some really good work in their congregations and providing a lot of leadership as well. Baby boomers, a big part of the congregation for a lot of us, President accounted for. On the right side, you see two other groups here. Generation X and Y are in pretty good numbers, and millennials are just really taking off. They're growing very fast here, and before long, they're going to have more of these than we do baby boomers. They're all members of your congregation. Hopefully, they're all representing your leadership. You're recruiting a lot of those folks on the right, as well as thanking and relying on those folks on the left here. But the people on the left, the builders and the boomers, tend to be institutional givers. I have joined this organization. I'm a part of this organization. I want it to operate and succeed well, and I will pledge accordingly. Folks on the right have got a somewhat different life experience. If you think about it, if you're a Gen X, Y, or a millennial, you've probably never known a time our country wasn't at war with somebody. You had a number of examples where you felt like your government and people in authority and power have lied to you. You've been let down by a number of institutions, and you've gone through one of the most brutal recessions we've had in about 100 years. That is not a group whose experience is going to lead them to trust institutions to the point that they'll want to give to them. Millennials have kind of an unfair reputation of being cheap and not being much in the way of donors. My experience is that's not true, realizing a number of them are quite young and don't have a lot of resources. But they tend to be outcome donors. If you can show me, if you can demonstrate to me, if you can be clear what it is you want to do with my money and what it is you hope to accomplish that'll make a difference in our congregation, in our community, in the world, I'm ready to donate to that. I've seen some very generous donations come in from millennials, much more than I would have expected, because somebody made that connection. If we could raise 5% more this year, here's what that total comes out to be. And here's some of the things, here's the list we could draw from, the things we could do better, differently, or new that we're not doing now. If we got 10%, here's some other items that we would draw from to do. Real things that people can look at and say, boy, that's worth doing. If we're just saying, gosh, we haven't given everybody a raise in 2 years and we need to buy some sheet music, that's not good enough. Why do we need to give a raise? Give me the good moral and the practical reasons for doing that. Why is it odd to spend money on sheet music or on lesson plans? Yeah, okay, I understand. RE, my public school teachers are having to buy their own supplies. I don't want RE teachers to do that. I got that. Give people a good practical as well as a motivational reason to give, and you'll find they tend to do that. One of the nicer little tools I've seen for doing that in years past is a little device we call Did You Know? I generally like to talk about mission budgets, not so much line item budgets, but one place where your line item can be useful. Go through your line item budget and pick out 12 items, very large and important items down to the sublimely ridiculous. And once a month, publish a little thing in your newsletter on your website and say, did you know? And talk about how you invest money in a particular area. And just remind people, this is one place our money goes that makes a difference, and your contributions make that possible. Thank you for doing that. The first one of these I did some years ago. We picked a really easy one. We picked coffee hour. And we said, in this congregation, we said, did you know we spend about $1,800 a year for coffee hour just to make sure we got fair trade coffee and a couple of refreshments we can all sit around and talk? And by the way, you might want to know that as near as we can calculate, our volunteers contribute about another $1,500 worth of supplies and never ask for reimbursement. So thank you for your gifts that make it possible for us to have a good coffee hour without putting out a jar, asking for money. And you might want to thank a volunteer next time you see them for making coffee hour a little nicer. I had 2 people come up to me the Sunday we published that and say, I just found out my pledge doesn't even buy coffee around here. I'm a little embarrassed by that. I think I could do a little better. Would you happen to have a pledge card on you? I've always got a pledge card on you. Of course we do that. But you can do that with big items and small items. But if you do that throughout the year, about every 4 weeks or so, it helps people get in a mindset, when we get money here, it accomplishes some things that are important for us. So you might want to think about that. My colleague, Kay Cryer, did a blog about a month and a half ago on our website with some good examples of that. I invite you to take a look at those. All right. rounding third base here. Metaphors work for me. So I've got a few metaphoric images for you to think about that's important for the board, particularly as you look at stewardship here. A set of metaphorical bifocals. And what that means is, and you know this full well as board members, you need to be keeping track of what's happening next. You know, what's going on in the next month, the rest of this year, what's happening in your term. We need to do well and stay ahead of events. But you also need to be keeping an eye on where you want your congregation to be 5 or 10 years from now. And ask yourself, are the things we're doing now going to reinforce that vision we've got down the road? And nothing is more important than stewardship and making that connection between today and tomorrow. We need to borrow a little something from the evangelicals. And I can't remember where I got this image, but I love having an evangelometer to show passion here. There's certainly a lot of abuses. We all can think about the TV ministers, but I've visited a number of small conventional Protestant and Catholic churches here where people are not shy at all about talking about their pledges. Not that anybody is particularly proud or ashamed of their pledge. They just get, this is how we actualize our vision here. This is an important part of being a member. And frankly, I'm glad to have the opportunity to share what I can here. It's really a part of their lives, more so than it is for us, and we could borrow that from them. Baseball has a lot to teach us. Every once in a while, I work with a congregation who just had a terrible stewardship campaign last year. Nothing went right, even though they really worked hard and thought they did a lot of things right here. And sometimes you did do a lot of things right, but it just didn't work out this year. I've often said the most powerful force in the world is the bell curve. Every once in a while, even when you try hard, things may not work out, but just think about the baseball metaphor. In baseball, if that guy can hit that ball 1 time out of 3, he's a hero. He's batting 300. He's making big bucks. He's carrying his team. So if you happen to have a bad stewardship campaign, don't lose heart. Just go to school, figure out are the things we could or should do differently. Pick yourself back up and start the next day planning for next year. Learn what lessons you can from the hard times here. I think the Buddhists have a number of things to teach us, but one of them is the idea of being intentional. Every once in a while, somebody will say, well, you know, it's hard to get anything done. We're all just volunteers and you get what you pay for. I think the Buddhists have a better approach to this. And as I understand the approach of intentionality from the Buddhist perspective, it's we're all here because we choose to be. We have said this is important to be in a community and the work we do here is important. And so we're going to be intentional about it. We're going to have some standards for ourselves. We'd like to have a really good campaign. We'd like to have a really healthy congregation. And so we expect some things of ourselves here and do this the way we'd like other people to do it. And then finally, keep in mind, I actually need to change this metaphor. A big ball of string to tie it all together. Probably the best metaphorical image I can think of for a congregation is a big spider web. If you pull here, it's going to affect something over here. It really is all connected. Certainly, stewardship is probably more true of that than most other things. If you make a tug on stewardship, good or bad, it's going to reverberate through your whole congregation. Everything we do in a congregation, I think, is important, but some are big time important, and your stewardship is one of them. That gives you the lifeblood that makes everything else possible in an operational sense. And so it's kind of one of the closing points I'd recommend that you carry forward to your congregation here. Stewardship is important because it denotes our commitment, but also because it actualizes everything else. If you and I are not willing to do a bit of stretching with our sharing here, then frankly, all the rest of this is just talk. We can talk about how important your values are and how much we love being in a community, but if we're not willing to share some of our hard-earned resources, it's really just talking, and we're all just customers. We're not members here. Stewardship is not a natural process for you to use very often. It takes a little while, a little thought to get there. And so engaging people in stewardship and in leadership and stewardship is just a terrific way to grow leaders and to build community here. I encourage board members always look around your own congregation and see, who would I really like to see on the board in about 5 years? And in between that time, get them involved in stewardship, either as a leader or as a visiting steward, and let them understand how that side of the congregation works. So if they come on the board, they'll be much more valuable and much more comfortable having those conversations. So I invite you to plan accordingly and to carry out your plans with that idea. If we get stewardship right, it empowers a lot of things. If we don't, we're going to be struggling about money and resources, and that's going to take time and energy away from things that you and I would rather be doing as members. I'm going to shut up in about 2 minutes and take your questions and comments. You'll have this slide. This is who we are. These are the things we do. We work with congregations, with clusters, with regions, and with UUA. We skipped the last year, but most years we do workshops at General Assembly, and we often do them at regional groups as well. So we invite you to take a look, and if you got questions, that's our website. Tells you how to reach us and what we do here. And again, if you're not taking our blog now, go on in and hit the website and sign up. Just take you about a minute. You'll get an email about once a month. Hey, there's a new blog posting about X. If that looks interesting, click it. If it doesn't, don't click it. And if you decide later you don't want to get that notice anymore, just go back to it and say, take me off, and we'll be happy to do that.